Hey everybody, Professor Snart checking in as we look at our next unit in our World Lit course here. Definitely a challenging one in terms of just the length of the reading that we're doing. And I'm talking about Unit 3 here, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Aeneid by Virgil. And I'm just looking at due dates really quickly here. So Unit 3 is due Tuesday, June 4th. So hopefully you've started to take a look at these already. One thing to remind you of, it's in the course, I'm sure you've seen it, but you're actually choosing one or the other of these. It's a little much to take on both. And in fact, especially with something like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which has, one of its interests for us is not the story per se, but its existence as just one of, if not the oldest piece of literature, which actually invites an interesting kind of etymology of the word literature, which is related to letters, which is quite literally a piece of written work. As with a lot of what we study, particularly these, ancient texts from ancient civilization, and I use the word text kind of loosely here, is that Gilgamesh is one of those stories that actually comes from a very long oral tradition. So to say something is an oral literature is actually a bit of a contradiction, because it's both verbal but also textual. It has this sort of physical existence. But of course we know what that means. And so what we read is challenging in terms of its length, but also in terms of just its fragmentary presentation. Because of this immensely long history that it's had, and even the version that we've got is not necessarily an authoritative or correct version from which there were variants produced. In fact, it is one among many variants, and one that, if you think about it, the notion of having like a book to read is actually a fairly recent invention, given the scope of what we're studying. So it would be much more normal for someone of that contemporary time period to be told a story, and if someone were to write that down, in fact, that written version, assuming that the technology for that even existed, that written version would be the aberration, not the norm, whereas we normally think of the other. If I read a book and then tell you about it, you don't then go and say, well, yes, I've now read that book too, because I've told you about it. Again, that conception of like there's an official written thing that I can tell you about, but that telling is just a kind of shadow or reflection of the thing. It's not the thing itself. That again it's not a universal constant. It's kind of a fairly recent cultural construct for us within the last, let's give it somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years. How's that for accuracy? But obviously with the invention of writing devices to write and record, and then ultimately movable type, and so the mass production, quote unquote, of texts, it's really only within that recent time frame that the notion of a text as kind of the authoritative edition has become what we accept as the norm. So I guess the bigger picture here, not to get bogged down in some of these details, is, again, one thing to think about when you look at a story like Gilgamesh is that so many of our cultural assumptions are informing the way that we read and the way that we navigate a text and what we expect from it, and where we feel successful in our reading or cheated because the text didn't deliver what we thought it was going to. So much of that is not just a natural given. They're cultural assumptions that we've grown up with, like for hundreds of years now as a culture. But again, something like Gilgamesh really brings us back to the idea of an oral tradition that becomes this contradictory term, like an oral literature. And so reading it in a textbook is really kind of a false experience in some ways. And if you choose to read that one, you'll notice that there are significant gaps, places where editors have had to kind of guess at what's being implied by the text. Of course, it's not written in any language that, is immediately accessible for us. So just basic stuff like that. It's not written in book form, all of those kinds of things are really challenging for us. And I guess what my point is not to say, oh, it's very difficult, don't do that one. But in fact, that with this and with the Aeneid, although to a much lesser degree with that one because of the culture that produced it, which is much closer to ours in terms of its technologies of writing and that kind of thing, and alphabet formation and that kind of thing by that point. But often, we're interested in those challenges it presents. So what you learn from reading Gilgamesh, for example, is not necessarily just information you derive from that text, but the whole experience of engaging with a text that really isn't or shouldn't be or wasn't a text for the longest time, for most of its history. So it has this real cultural distance from us that I think is really interesting to explore. And here's where our course itself is interesting, because this dichotomy shows up over and over again. Despite that cultural difference, there's some aspects of it as a literary work that are still very close to us culturally. And of course, what we're looking at here is the notion of a hero, in this case, an epic hero. And this is an idea that really has been with us from the start. There's really no literature of whatever culture, of whatever time period, that has not produced stories in which a hero figured. And I don't just mean like every story has a main character. I mean a hero in a sense that is not something that is this major cultural gap that we have to fill. Well, what did they think a hero was? You can read Gilgamesh and get a sense like this is just but this is a superhero. He's larger than life. And one of the things that we often think is that early literature is very simplistic. It has simple characters. They stand for these ideas instead of being complex or dynamic or having motivations of their own. And it's only recently that we've developed these darker heroes that have multiple sides or personalities or questionable pasts, and that their motivations are questionable and their psyches are damaged somehow. And in fact, this is what's produced their heroic nature or their heroic deeds. Actually, our contemporary age has probably been the worst about losing the complexity that literary heroes have had from the get-go, and Gilgamesh is a perfect example. I mean, he is no role model, let's be clear about that. But between you and me, that's what makes it interesting to read, right? The 50s and 60s, 1950s and 60s era American Superman is not really that interesting a guy if you get right down to it. I mean, he wore tights and like his underwear on the outside, but other than that, not much interesting going on there. He's good. That's about it. And so we think, oh, it's only recently that we've, invested this complexity into the heroes we produce, when in fact that impulse actually takes us back to the oldest ways in which cultures imagined heroes, not as role models, and the Greek and Roman gods are another good example of this. They embody an aspect of humanity writ larger than life, so we can see it. It's almost like watching a film, an IMAX version of the thing, so you really see right everything. But they're by no means, just because, even if they're unidimensional in terms of a particular ability that they have, they're super strong or super fast or whatever, they're rarely simple characters. They have complex motivations. If you think of the Greek and Roman tradition, they have really complex. It's like a soap opera with all of the family dynamics that are going on. And again, they don't present role models for correct behavior all the time. They present behavior, right, writ large, that we as an audience are now meant to kind of grapple with. So we see our best aspects, but also our worst. And again, that was part of the earliest literatures that we've got, literature that wasn't even literature in the sense of it having a physical presence. So from the very start of storytelling, heroes have been complex and not unidimensional. That's only a fairly recent development that we are slowly getting away from, because it's boring after a while. There's a little bit in here about how heroes tend to be a cultural product. They're not just the static thing that exists through time. And so you can think about what in a given era might produce a hero that is either complex and kind of gritty and not too pure, versus an era that maybe needs a hero that is just one perfect shining example, because that doesn't exist, or there are fears in the world, or you think of Superman as like a post-World War II kind of hero, or anything in that kind of area. If that age needed a pure hero, maybe. It's hard to say. I mean, it's not science, of course, but it's interesting to think about. Okay, so whatever I'm talking about here, it's basically that what I'd like you to enter into these readings with, especially these ones that are quite dense, just a lot of pages and maybe a style that's not totally familiar, is that we're not reading for every piece of information or every, nuance of action or dialogue or every little bit. We really are reading to get a sense of just an awareness that these things existed and when they existed and out of what culture they come, but also a sense of just how complex literature has been for the millennia that it's existed. Complex literature is not a modern or postmodern, invention. It something about the natural or cultural impulse to tell stories has always been to tell them as these complex things. It's kind of amazing. So it's that level of big idea that I'd really like you to keep in mind as we do these readings, not to get bogged down and then, of course, frustrated, so you just really don't do the readings at all. You end up trying to look up some summary and spark notes because, yes, that's easier as far as like the information that you might want to get. But hopefully you can see the value of getting something other than that information about the text. Even if it's stuff like plot, I'm just not too concerned that you get every single plot event that happens necessarily. I'm much more interested that you have questions at the end and really aren't sure entirely what happened or what the relationship of all the characters are in their, all the nuances of them. But that you've experienced the text itself, not just read a couple pages, got frustrated because you weren't getting it, quote unquote, whatever that means. And so you just go online and find some summary. Yeah, you can do that, but that's really not what we're trying to get at in a course like this. You want exposure to the actual thing itself, at least as close as we can come in terms of what's presented in our textbook. So take on the challenge as an exciting opportunity to experience a literature that you probably never would otherwise, in some cases, that you maybe have heard about, and that comes from a culture that is, in many ways, in so many fundamental ways, like what a text even is, a culture that didn't understand it or didn't know or didn't need to know or want to know what a book was. And even when they produced them, they looked nothing like what we've got today in terms of pages that are bound together, reading left to right. None of that stuff applied. It's pretty interesting. So take that up as an interesting challenge and stick with the text itself. Don't read a few pages, get frustrated, and then just turn elsewhere for like a summary, so now you understand or get what happened in Gilgamesh or the Aeneid. It's just not that fun that way. Very simplistic, heroic behavior there, not complex like we're interested in. Okay, as usual, if you have questions or concerns, be in touch with me, and otherwise I'll talk to everyone soon.